no matter how deep you dive when you think about Ukrainians, be careful. Because sometimes I see what they do and I don't understand, because I don't understand a motivation.
That was George Mamsurov. We recorded, Gary and I recorded an interview with him about a week or two ago, and we've been waiting to bring it back on because we were going to discuss this issue that he had been talking about and bring his voice to the screen here so you can see what the Russian side thinks. And we're hoping, and we're having some technical difficulties here actually, to bring him in live at the end of this. So I'm hopeful that we can figure that out in time to bring him on live here to bring us some updates of things that are actually going on in the conflict today, as it turns out. But just so you understand, that first clip there was George and I talking. He has some English. It's not that great, or at least he wasn't comfortable with it. I think it's better than he was thinking. But we had some problems on the day of the recording to loop in his translator, a guy named Andre. And it took like almost 45 minutes to get everything lined up. And by the time it finally got hit, I had run out of time and I had another obligation that I couldn't drop. And so Gary picks it up and runs with the rest of it and does the interview, which, as you'll see, was really, really good and very, very informative. I want to say a couple of things before we show anything of what follows here, just so people understand. As we talk about all the time on this channel, our intent is to show you many different voices, not just an echo chamber that only shares what I want to share. And we let people do their own speaking, whether that's Ukrainian, whether that's European, American, or Russian. And so we have had many times, we've had folks who were on the Ukrainian side of the line. We've had folks who were on the Russian side of the line. And this one I think is very important because he talks about a number of the things that are related to what many in the West are talking about right now in terms of how the war is going to be solved, what people think about it, etc. He is a former soldier and a current journalist in Russia. And he works for, I think, an outfit called Solovyov Live, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. He does not speak for the Russian government. He doesn't speak for anyone other than himself. This is his personal opinion. Many people, I'm sure, will take issue with how he characterizes things. This is not an intent to try and play gotcha with anybody or to sabotage anything. The only purpose of this is that so you can hear from the Russian side of the line how they view things. And that is so critically important, which is why we're going to also have some Ukrainian folks here coming up in the near future, so you can hear from their own mouth how they view things. And that kind of helps, especially a Western audience, an American one in particular, understand how complex this is when you have two sides thinking really differently about the war, about the causes of the war, what's at stake, etc. And then that comes down to, and what it seems to always does, is what happens on the ground. Now, for brevity's sake, what we've done in the bulk of this episode here is to have just the voice of the translator, so we just save some time as it's going all the way back. But I do want to show you a section of how the interview was conducted to include both directions of the translation, at least in one section. So you can see how Gary would ask a question, the translator would send it over, back, forth, etc. But even in the midst of this is something on the drone warfare, and there's going to be quite a bit on that because that is a dominant force in today's combat. So I want you to see how this was conducted, and then from this point forward, it will just be the translator's voice.
The drone forces that Ukraine has, it's been so highly publicized how strong and efficient and what they've developed over the course of the war. Has he confronted any of the drones himself, or has he been near, or, can you just talk about that, what his experience has been?
Тебя просят рассказать, как изменились украинские дроны, как их стало больше, и расскажи про собственный опыт, когда ты бегал там по Суджи, например, и уворачивался от дронов. Вообще, как это было?
Есть ли там вопрос, как в целом изменилась война из-за дронов?
Да.
В первую очередь я хотел бы сказать, что та война, которая начиналась в 2022 году, и та война, которая происходит сейчас, это абсолютно две разные войны.
First of all, the war that started in 2022 and the present war are two absolutely different wars.
Если делить это время на части, то витков развития было на моей памяти, наверное, 5 или 6.
There were several stages of the escalation and of the development of warfare, and he thinks that there were 5 or 6 milestones when the warfare changed.
Чтобы не перечислять каждый из них, скажу, что самый популярный, самый на слуху, это, конечно же, дроны. А самое последнее из нововведений, которые поменяли правила войны, это дроны на оптоволокне.
The first thing that changed the modern warfare is the massive use of drones. And the most recent thing that changed the warfare are the drones operated with optofiber. Do I get this right? Optofiber it is, yes?
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
optical fiber, yes.
Yeah, optic fibers, yeah.
Yes.
Fiber.
Я на данный момент уверен и могу сказать, что практически 80% боевых действий на данный момент так или иначе ведется с применением либо дронов-разведчиков, либо дронов-камикадзе.
He may say that approximately 80% of the modern warfare is conducted using either FPV drones, kamikaze drones, or surveillance drones who survey the battlefield.
That's good enough right there, Gary. That's a good spot right there. That just really emphasizes, how big of a change, and you're going to hear a little bit more of this in a minute, about the difference between 2022 when Russia started it, when they invaded Ukraine for the first time, and where it is today. And you've heard us talk about this many times on the channel, both myself and many of our guests, is that Russia made a number of tactical errors at the beginning of this war. They did not understand. They had not learned enough of the lessons of the Azerbaijan-Armenia war in 2020. They had not just paid enough attention to the development of technology that had led up to that point. And so at the beginning, they had a vastly understated expectation about the role that drones would play and how it would impact maneuver, especially. And the Ukraine side was a little bit further ahead, still not quite as far as they would get later. But at the beginning, they were a little bit further ahead than Russia, and that helped to blunt some of the penetrations that Russia had. Though at the beginning, Ukraine wasn't prepared numerically with drones either, so they couldn't bring a lot of drones to bear to stop. So that's one of the reasons why these 5 axes of approach that Russia had on the initial invasion were successful at getting so deep so fast, because the Ukraine side wasn't prepared for that. Gary asked him some more about some of the specific differences between 2022 and today.
The Ukrainian forces have many different types of drones. Some of them are made abroad. Some of them are their own creations, made in in small labs, and they produce quite a lot of them. But Russian Ministry of Defense has made giant lines of production, and Russia now is producing maybe less models of drones, but the quantities are absolutely tremendous, and the front is enriched by Russian drones at the moment. And when Russian economy became the war economy, when Russian factories and military factories started producing drones en masse, they managed to outperform themselves. And now our front line is, we have a lot of drones. At the beginning of the conflict, drones weren't used in such large qualities. And to tell the truth, in 2022, almost no one understood the true potency of them, how harmful they could be. So when we were at the front lines, me and my cameraman, we didn't even pay too much attention to the skies.
Yeah, so that's just shows you how much difference the war was. Where he was apparently a journalist on the Russian side covering the advance of the Russian forces in there, and they didn't even pay attention to skies. I assure you that is no longer the case anywhere near the front line on either side of it, because right now you literally take your life into your hands if you, as some of the folks we've shown you on both the Russian and the Ukraine side have said, if you just get out of your trenches to go to the bathroom, you literally taking your life into your hands. And so that has dramatically changed. And we saw that actually in the first. If anybody had learned some of the lessons of the Azerbaijan-Armenia war, it was the Ukraine side, because they actually had some of those same drones. I think they were called the Bakhtiar drones. And they were used in pretty small quantities. And so that validates what we have seen outside, and what his experience was, is that at first the quantity of the drones, in addition to the quality, was just not there. And again, it's one of the reasons why Russia was able to just flood in so deep, because there simply weren't enough of the Bakhtiars, or anything else for that matter, to really stop them. At that point, especially in the beginning, artillery was still the king of the battle. But he continued on here talking about how rapidly they created, and how the Russian side, once they figured out what was needed, how they solved that problem.
Drones became a thing when people understood that you can use a small drone which costs almost nothing to destroy a tank which costs millions of dollars. That you can harass enemy supply lines without losing your people, without losing expensive artillery shells. You just take an operator and attack them. And when it became evident that drones are super effective, both sides switched to using drones instead of using heavy armored vehicles, etc. And the thing is that the Russian civil society, it modernized itself. It understood that the front needs a lot of drones, and Russian civilian people started assembling, offering the Ministry of Defense different models, and the people from the Ministry of Defense started to work with our civilian engineers, trying to find out the best models and to start producing them for the needs of our army.
You may recall we had a show on, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I can't remember now when, where we had a Russian drone operator, actually not a drone operator, I'm sorry, a drone builder. And he's one of these people that George was talking about right there, that was from the civil society. And that they said, hey, we have technological capability. And so they were learning how to build these drones, et cetera, and how to make them better and all that kind of stuff. And so he talked about it. And that's what we saw actually on a very large scale. Again, both sides of the line. The Ukraine side did the exact same thing, does the exact same thing, is that they have lots of small individual companies that vie to make these, and some of them come up with their own designs, their own modifications, et cetera, and they keep iterating them and go into the front line. Things that don't work get jettisoned, things that do work get reinforced. And apparently, according to what they're saying here, is that when some of these smaller firms that are nimble and that they can make changes like overnight, whereas some of the big firms and factories, et cetera, are very, very slow to change just because of the nature of how a factory runs, the bureaucracy and all that. They bypassed a lot of that by saying, hey, let's get a lot of these little guys. And then once somebody comes up with a model that works and can be sustained in combat, then they'll take it to the larger firms, and then they'll mass produce them on scales that the other side, some of these smaller folks just can't ever produce. And the Ukraine side is similar to that, but not quite as much, because they don't have control of the skies, and they can't have large factories anywhere, because then they become a target for Russian Iskander missiles or Kinzhals or some of these other hypersonics or even drones, and they can't protect everything everywhere, so they end up getting blown up. So that means that Ukraine has to make smaller firms and smaller production factories and trying to keep them a secret from everybody, and then scatter them everywhere. And that is effective in one sense, because you don't have a single point of failure. Russia can't launch a missile and take out an entire factory. If they do take out something, it's a small one, so the impact is not big. But the problem is also it's harder to get things to scale. So it's kind of a win or lose kind of situation. You just got to pick your poison, is the bottom line, because it is, after all, warfare. Then we moved on to a different topic here. And one of the things that has really been a point of contention, especially in the West, is the relationship between the Slavic Brotherhood of the Ukraine side and the Russian side. And, there's history that you may recall when Tucker Carlson went to interview Vladimir Putin in, I think it was early 2023. He talked to him and went to Russia, and he famously gave this really long history lesson going back centuries and talking about the relationship between the two sides, et cetera. And then you have other folks that are saying, no, actually, Russia hates the Slavs. They hate the Ukraine. They think they're subhuman or something like that. All different kinds of things. So we thought, let's ask him, how does the Russian side see the Ukraine side?
In Russia, there are hundreds of nationalities, and they are considered as brothers. And Ukrainians are our brother nation, and we always had good relationship with them. But suddenly, since 2014, it changed, and somehow Ukrainians became self-excluded from our brother family. And he is wondering how could that happen, because people who love each other, who know each other for such a long time, they suddenly became enemies. And he said that there were a lot of different small things that alienated nations to each other, and they caused this conflict in the end. So it was long-term provoked by something from not from the inside, but from the outside.
So his comment is that this was something that was externally pushed, i.e. that the two sides were put in enmity towards each other because they had cousin kind of relationship, if I can use that term, historically. And obviously during the Soviet times, everybody got along relatively well, and there wasn't a whole lot of problem until the events of 2014. And that's when we certainly know from the historical record, and we've shown you videos that prove it one way or the other, you don't even have to take anyone's word for it, is that the United States and many in Europe helped foster the overturning of a legally elected government in Ukraine in 2014, taking advantage of the violence of the Maidan affair, et cetera, and basically installed a Western-friendly government after that. The Russians call it a coup. The Western side calls it a people making their own choice and self-determination, et cetera. You can wordsmith it all day long. But the bottom line is that the West got really involved, the United States in particular. And I think that I think it's pretty fair to say that there were many on the Western side that desired to cause problems for Russia and fostered the enmity between the two sides and fed it so that it continued on to have this, growing level of anger and then towards outright hatred. Trump talks about this all the time, is that the hatred between the two sides is just off the charts. Definitely Zelensky does not even attempt to hide his hatred of Russia and Putin in particular. So the question is going to be, is this something that can be overcome? My guess is that over time that it can be, because you're talking about historical relations going back centuries that where they were, there's of the similar ancestry, et cetera. And I think with good leadership and enough time to let a lot of this anger boil down, I think that they can be, and I certainly hope that's the case. However this is resolved into the future, everybody's going to have to learn to live together. They're going to have to live in proximity to one another. And look, I mean, history shows it a lot. I mean, there's the hatred, the absolute just vicious hatred between, say, France and Germany after World War II, after Germany invaded them, or between Britain and Germany. And you see that over time, those got healed, and then they ended up being, close allies. Same with Vietnam. We just detested each other with all of our heart. Now then you see Trump actually bragging about doing deals with Vietnam, et cetera, and the doors are open. So it has happened in the past. It will happen at some point in the future. The sooner, the better for all the people involved. And we need to make sure that we stop doing things that fan the flames of the divisions to keep it going for nefarious purposes that serve no one's interest on the ground, only the pockets of some who benefit from the conflict, which is a separate issue, which we'll address at a different time. One of the other questions that Gary asked was, it's often said, actually routinely said by both Zelensky and many European leaders, that we have to support Ukraine because if we don't, then if after Russia takes Ukraine, they're coming for the West. Here's what he said about that.
To make Russia to to obey to some other conditions imposed by Europe, you have to win in a military way. You have to break our army and impose this by force. But as we see at the moment, it has not been achieved in a slightest manner. So we've not been broken, we've not been beaten. We don't listen to European ideas because they can't impose them to us. We need to talk, not to wage war.
And I'm sorry, I got distracted there for a second. I just got a note from apparently from George that it looks like he can join us. He might be a little bit late, so we'll need to extend this out. If we can't get him on before we finish here, we may put forward another link. So be watching our channel here because we may put a separate link out at the end if he can't make it on quite by the time we finish here. But good news is that we're going to have him back on very shortly to talk about some of the updated situations. Let's see, where were we? So okay, so that was with Russia saying, yeah, we're not looking to go anywhere else, but, and that was kind of one of the key things there. This is different than what a lot of people are saying. Russia and Vladimir Putin keeps talking over and over about how he's going to, the negotiated deal on the table. What Sergei Lavrov has said is that it's the 4 provinces, all the administrative borders you have to withdraw, and Crimea, and then denazification, demilitarization, and all that stuff. But the man on the ground, this is his opinion. Let me stress that again. This is his view, but I have seen it echoed among many, to include to some general officers on the Russian side who have said this out loud and not been censored. So one has to wonder what the problem is. And he says, no, we won't stop. We can't stop until we have Odessa and Kiev. Now, whether Russia can do that, whether they can make good on that, whether Vladimir Putin would go along with that is anyone's guess. But this shows you pretty clearly. And again, this George here is a journalist. So he talks to all kinds of people all over the front. He himself fought for a period of time as well. And as I said, I mean, even up to members of Duma, there is quite a few folks in Russia. A lot of they have their own version of neocons, if you will, that are don't want to settle for anything. Many in Russia don't even want the Western side to accept this deal that's been on the table since June 14 of last year, with all the terms that we keep mentioning here, or with the ones in Istanbul, that 12-point plan Gary keeps showing periodically. They don't want them to accept that either, because they want, that one right there, they want to be able to continue moving forward and taking the territory. And one of the reasons they cite is because of the lack of trust in the West. From the Russian perspective, the Minsk agreements were not agreed to, not by the Russians, not failed to follow by the Russians, but from the West. And they cite Angela Merkel and the French president at the time, and they keep saying, look, you guys said openly that you never really intended for it to be followed. You just wanted it to buy Ukraine time to get more weapons, more ammunition, more training, grow their force, etc. And so the Russian side is saying, and plus we had this deal nearly signed in Istanbul in March, April of 2022. And every time something gets close to peace, somebody sabotages it on the Western side. So we're not going to trust anything. We don't want to trust your word for anything. We'll only go to secure our security with our own hands, with our own forces, and we'll impose the kind of conditions that we'll accept, period, without any negotiations or discussion, and they'll have something long term. That's what many in the Russian side says. So it's not without some justification when some people fear that Russia doesn't want to stop where they are. They don't want to stop on the current line of contact, which is one of the things that Keith Kellogg has many times mentioned as something, an objective. Even when the West talks about a just and lasting peace, even they begrudgingly will say, well, everything that's been lost up to the current line of contact, that we're not going to get that back. But then they want all these other conditions, but even they're willing to say here, but the Russians are saying, yeah, no, we're not going to stop right here. The Russian is at the fighting level. Everything, though, depends on what the Russian at the top level, Vladimir Putin and his coterie of high-ranking advisors, that's the only thing that matters is what he ends up saying. So we have to wait and see what's going to happen with that. One of the other things that we talked about here, this is a really interesting aspect as well, is that we've shown especially Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, famous for saying this, is that we want to force Russia into a peace that's just and lasting and all this kind of stuff, according to Western definitions of what is just and reasonable. And we ask, George, what do you think about what the West is saying about forcing Russia into a peace?
To make Russia to obey to some other conditions imposed by Europe, you have to win in a military way. You have to break our army and impose this by force. But as we see at the moment, it has not been achieved in the slightest manner. So we've not been broken, we've not been beaten. We don't listen to European ideas because they can't impose them to us. We need to talk, not to wage war.
So he's saying, yeah, you can force somebody if you want, or you can try to force them, but in order to do that, you have to compel their army. And that's one of the things we've been talking about on this channel. And I have been talking about it in written publications and in other TV appearances, really even before the war started, is that you have to defeat the Russian conventional military. They tried that in 2023. It was an utter catastrophe and a total devastating defeat against the Ukraine side. They tried to force Russia out. They didn't even penetrate the first line of defense anywhere. They got up to it in one spot, never got through it, and then now it's been going back to the West ever since that time at the cost of profound numbers of Ukrainian soldiers. So you can talk about forcing Ukraine, forcing a peace on Vladimir Putin, but if you don't have the capacity on the ground to compel it, then it's just noise. It's hot air. It's self-delusion. And I think that's where we are. In fact, if I recommend you watching our show this afternoon at 3 p.m. with Jeremy, Commodore Steve Jeremy, we're going to be talking about exactly that, because that's exactly what the West is doing right now, is just totally disconnected from reality and talking from a different plane, as though that they're on the backside of the end of the war, and they're talking about a reconstruction, all this kind of stuff, and how they're going to have all these businesses do all this sort of thing, none of which is even theoretically possible unless you have a peace. And you can't get to a peace, not the one that you want, unless you do one of two things: either negotiate an end to the terms that are on the table from the Russian side right now, or you compel it by defeating the Russian military. That ain't going to happen. Actually, neither of those things is going to happen. So that's a big problem. But you see that the Russians, many of them are actually hoping that they continue on. And by the way, we've seen even some comments. I didn't have a chance to cut them today, but Maria Zakharova, as well as Sergei Lavrov and some other Russian leaders today, said we're going to keep fighting until we have a settlement that's a political outcome that we can live with. Meaning that they're moving in that direction. They're not just going to the borders of the four regions there and then stopping. As we see, the Russians continue to move, not just in those four regions, but also in the Kharkiv region and in the Sumy region, and now in the Dnepropetrovsk region. So there's 3 additional regions already that have some fighting, and the Russians aren't stopping anywhere. So if you don't want Russia to take Odessa, if you don't want them to take Kiev, you're going to have to start doing something right now to change that dynamic. And talking a bunch of nonsense about something that's going to happen at the end of the war on your terms without the capacity to get there, holy cow, that is some world-class level delusion. And unfortunately, I kind of chuckle when I say it, but I can't really laugh too hard, because it's the Ukraine people, as you're seeing on the screen right there. I think these are just the attacks overnight again, because there's another, I think it was 400 missiles and drones that were launched overnight again. I think something just a little under 500. And you see, it just continues to be devastation across the board here. The Ukrainians mockingly and laughingly say they intercepted almost everything, as they say nearly every night, and yet you see the physical evidence that they're not. So these missiles and rockets are scoring and hitting the home. And there's nothing the Ukraine side can do, and a handful of more missiles from the U.S. is not going to make any difference. Let's see. One of the other ones I wanted to look at here. Let's see. The other day we played, actually several times now. It was in regards to, at the time, was a pause that had been announced of interceptor missiles and 155 millimeter artillery shells by the United States. We showed Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell try to put everybody at ease and say, we're just doing this internal audit and all this kind of stuff. And then at the end of that clip, he says something that has almost been a mantra of all the leaders in the Pentagon and the White House for decades, is that we are the most lethal fighting force on the planet. And he says, if you need any more proof of that, just look at this happen, what the United States did by hitting the nuclear sites in Iran a couple of days before. And as I said at the time, yet that's not what you need to look at. If you want to prove who's the best, most lethal force on the planet, that means everybody else on the planet is in the competition here. So what you need to look at is not a bombing run, a single bombing run that the United States did, but who's fighting a modern war against a peer opponent, and that is Russia and Ukraine. So when asked the question of who is the most lethal fighting force on the planet, George had, shall we say, a different answer.
The Russian army currently, paying in sweat, in blood, and in bodies of their fallen comrades, we are gaining the experience how to fight Western armies, how to fight Ukrainian's army. We are gaining the experience of tactics. We understand the modern warfare, how to use drones, how to use modern APC, modern unmanned aircraft, etc., etc. And it makes this conflict, paid by blood and by sweat, makes our army the strongest army in the world. And second army comes the Ukrainian army, because they, as our army, is the only military force that has the experience of a large-scale conflict, of the modern large-scale conflict. Every modern army which wants to get that experience, which wants to understand the realities of the modern war, there's only one way to get this experience, to get involved in this war, to send soldiers, officers, and that's the only way how you can get the understanding of how the next conflicts between big countries will look like.
Okay, so when Sean Parnell said that the other day, we asked, is this just boasting? So the question is fair here too. Is this just Russia boasting? Are they saying, yeah, we're the most, we're the strongest military on the planet too. We're better. And the number two, just as right behind it, is Ukraine. And everybody else falls off the table somewhere else. So we have to ask, is this just boasting? Because everybody wants to say they're the best. But a couple of things he said there, I think, bring to light. So you looked at the justification of Sean Parnell and you look at the justification of George Mamsurov, and you got to say, yeah, when you look at the actual evidence on the ground, I think that there's a better case to make that it's the Russians right now. And of course, I will actually argue from a dispassionate military perspective, just looking at this from analytics, taking off your national anything else and just saying what's true, it's unquestionably the Russian army, without hesitation, without equivocation. It is the Russian army. Ukraine is very strong, but they are unequivocally number two, and it's shown itself out on the battlefield exactly that way. And the second part of that clip we just showed, it tells you the reason why, and that is because they have the physical experience. It's one thing to do simulations. It's one thing to do field training exercises, and it is a radically different thing to do actual combat operations. And this is exactly what we saw play out with Russia. So one of the reasons I initially thought Russia would do much better, much quicker, and that I thought within a few months that they would be able to militarily defeat the Ukraine side was because I had looked at the training that the Russian army had done in the years prior to it. They had done a number of very large-scale military maneuvers, large-scale operations, lots of training, and again, in the field, at scale, etc. And so I saw what they had reported. What I didn't know was what they had done in those. And a lot of it was purely scripted, and they were not actually training because they were cutting corners and they just wanted to look good, probably for their domestic press as much as anybody else. But they did themselves no service. The Russians didn't, when they cut all these corners and just pretended like lots of things. Basically what they were doing was driving around in different spots from point A to point B. They weren't doing any actual simulated work of what would happen if an enemy force was actually trying to hit them, etc. So they fooled themselves, worst of all, because they thought, and I think Vladimir Putin thought, that they would be able to perform in like they did in a lot of these exercises, like Zapad and some of the other ones, on the actual battlefield. Turned out they were dramatically wrong, because you can hide all kinds of things in training. You can't hide any of them when you're under fire. That's what the Russians discovered. It took them a year and a half, I think, to get through and burn a lot of that foolishness off and self-delusion. And then they finally said, all right, now it's time to roll up our sleeves and focus on reality. That's why Commodore Jeremy keeps telling us over and over that he thinks that the West is focusing its policies on a preferred narrative, and the Russians are focusing their policies on reality. And now then that, but it didn't start that way. We, on the other hand, are still where the Russians were prior to 2021 or prior to 2022, in that we do lots of exercises, we do lots of simulations, etc. But I guarantee you, and I'm promising you, we do not have the mental understanding of what it's like to not be able to get out of a slit trench for worrying about being killed by some drone buzzing around your head somewhere, or that you can't even drive more than a platoon of vehicles anyone ever without having either missiles, drones, or artillery rounds or rockets fall on you, or airstrikes come in. We have no concept of what that is like. And that experience, as he said toward the end of that, is irreplaceable. You can train, you can imagine, you can do everything you can think of, but until you endure under that, you just don't know how it's going to work. For example, you can have this large-scale military operation and training, and you can have it planned that this company is going to be a blocking force here and going to lay down some suppressive fire. This other unit here, this other company is going to come in from the flank, and it's going to provide crossfire here. And then maybe a third unit is going to try and come in from the backside of it to, undo it, whatever. So you have your plan there. That's what you're going to do. Well, that's fine on paper. It's perfectly valid on paper. But the problem is when you get in reality, and now when this first force here runs into a buzzsaw, and all of a sudden it's getting decimated by drones because it doesn't even get to the launch point to where it's supposed to be providing all its suppressive fire. So it's not providing its suppressive fire because it gets ground down before it gets there by both artillery and drones. And then this other force that's supposed to be the assault force, it's not able to do the assault because the enemy was never suppressed on the front line. It's also firing attrition. And now then what's this third force? It's supposed to be the exploitation force coming in from the rear, et cetera. None of that stuff gets off the ground. And now then, the commander has to, on the fly, what are you going to do now? What is the plan? This one just went to crap here, and you got guys bleeding all over the place. You're trying to get medical evacuations, et cetera. You're coming under withering fire, and the objective hasn't even been assaulted yet, much less taken. That's the kind of thing that we can't simulate. We can try, but the mental part of it, and this is a lot of stuff that I studied. I myself have 4 combat deployments. But don't think too much of that, because my level of combat is not a fraction of what these guys suffered here. I had a single tank-on-tank battle, which was pretty intense, I'll say, for the majority of an evening, late at dusk and into the night. That's about it. So we had some enemy fire. They didn't have any artillery. They didn't have any air power. They didn't have any air defense. So the tanks were pretty tough, and the infantrymen were pretty tough, but we didn't have any of the stuff that we had here, and only a few artillery rounds or mortar rounds were fired anywhere near me. And frankly, I didn't even know that they had fired near me until after the conflict was over, and my driver told me that, oh, by the way, yeah, there was some artillery rounds popping around here. He said, that's why I went under my hatch, et cetera. I didn't even know. So it didn't have any effect on me. But these guys, it's not the case. And for an American army to go in now and then in large scale like this situation I just described for you, it is going to be really, really hard for us. And so until we've done it, we cannot claim to be the most lethal military force on the planet. That is arrogant, it is self-deceiving, and it's not true. So it's not to be pro-Russian or anything else, to acknowledge the truth. And that's what I'm trying to do here. We need to be sober-minded and acknowledge the truth so we don't get into some stupid war because we think we're as good as Sean Parnell said, and then we make policy choices based on the belief that we are better than they are when we're not as good as they are, because then this ugly scenario I drew for you here could actually play out, and then we're in a world of hurt if we get into a situation like that unprepared, which is what I think would happen. So let's keep sober-minded. Last thing that we asked George was, where is this going? What's going to come next? How will the war end? Here's what he said.
As practice shows, if you don't have an army, if you don't have muscles, if you don't have huge forces, no one listens to you. And even at the negotiating table, you will be ignored and mocked at.
Но с одним небольшим «но» на наших условиях.
So I hope that this war will finally end with an agreement at the negotiating table, but these negotiations will be conducted on our terms. We need to demilitarize them to save Russian populace on the territory of the Ukraine, which is being, to tell the truth, genocided. And the main aim of this operation is to destroy the enemy state and to make it at least a neutral state, not to conquer it, but to pacify it.
So you see there that they're saying, look, until you have an army that can swing a big stick and the other side can't defect or parry that stick, nobody's going to listen to you. But if you do, they'll have to listen to you. And that is the Russian mentality. I think that can fairly be ascribed to how the Russians writ large are thinking. We have a big stick right now, and you can't stop it. And we can go fast, we can go slow, but we're choosing this path, at least they have so far, to go slow, though there is some evidence that that's starting to change, especially with this air power in coordination with what's happening on the ground, that they're saying, listen, we're going to continue to go forward until we get everything done that we need by our definition to have security. And there's no reason to think that they're not going to be able to succeed with that. And you see, even in his telling there, they have previously told you that at least the Russians that he deals with say, no, we're going to have to take Kiev and we're going to have to take Odessa, which gives them complete control and blockage of the entire access to the Black Sea and any kind of ports down there. So that basically leaves the whatever's going to be left of the rump Ukraine completely at the mercy of the Russians, and they'll have to coordinate with them to be able to use the ports and stuff. But you also heard in the second part there that the Russians aren't thinking of like conquering the country of Ukraine and taking it over, but of pacifying it to their degree so that it doesn't pose a threat to them. So there is room for the Russians, and this is matched by what we've seen diplomatically from Sergei Lavrov, from Putin himself, etc., that they don't want to take over Ukraine. They just want it to be governed by someone who's not going to pose a threat to them and that doesn't have a military that can pose a threat, even with the West. And then Russia's going to say, y'all can govern yourself with whatever's left. So the fair question would be, well, how can we trust Russia? And the answer is you can't. You can't. You can say, I don't believe that they would do that. I don't believe that they would allow us, the Ukraine side, to have business, et cetera, that would be able to use the ports and have access, et cetera. I don't believe that they would stop there. I can't say with any kind of confidence that they wouldn't, except that it's logical and rational that they wouldn't. But here's the thing. If you're not going to engage in any diplomacy to give them a reason not to, then by default, you've given Russia a reason to keep going, because this is the consequence of getting involved in helping to overthrow this legally elected government in 2014. This is the consequence of not faithfully applying the Minsk agreements. This is the consequence of getting out of things like the ABM treaty, which we thought was going to be to our advantage for a while. Turned out that it helped Russia develop new categories and new classes of weapons, etc. These are the consequences for decades of missteps by the United States and the West. And now we're in a position to where we either have to eat a lot of crow and it's a huge portion of humble pie, or we're going to pay an even bigger price, because Russia is going to not only not be weakened, they're going to be strengthened even more. And they're going to go maybe all the way up to the Dnieper River, which could well include beyond it in the south to Odessa and up to the head of the Dnieper River in Kiev. Now, I think it's illogical that they would go any further than that, and the Russians don't have the facilities and the capacity right now to go beyond that. But if they chose to do so, that certainly in the Baltics, I got to say that's a difference there. They do have the conventional capacity to do that, but then you have the Article 5 issues there, and then you have the huge risk of nuclear war. And I don't know that Putin would risk nuclear war by taking the Baltics. I don't think he would need to. So I doubt that he would, but I can't take anything away. And you can't just remove that from the table and said they won't, because no one knows. I'm not even sure that Russia knows what it would do. Bottom line is, we have got to change what we're doing here, because these are the realities here. This is the view from one Russian journalist and one former Russian troop who covers a lot of areas. But you can see that there are echoes of these same kind of mentality through many levels of Russian leaders that we keep showing you. We'll see what's going to happen with that. It doesn't look like we're going to get George on here live. We're going to try. Keep watching our channel here for a link to pop up. If we can make it happen today, we'll make it happen. If not, we'll get him on as soon as we possibly can. We have Commodore Jeremy scheduled to come on at 3 p.m. We're going to hit that unless, if we can do what we want, we might try to move that back 30 minutes and try to get George in before, because I know it's kind of fresh on people's minds. Sorry we weren't able to link it up with this one, but he's a correspondent on the front lines, and sometimes his schedule is not his own. And as we've seen with other folks we've tried to interview, I don't know if you remember, but one of the Russians, actually a British citizen who was fighting for the Russian side, was delayed by several weeks, because on his way to our interview, he got attacked by a drone and had his leg broken. So it's a perilous situation here, and we get what we can. But that's the situation from here today, and we will see you either at 3 o'clock with Steve Commodore Jeremy, or maybe sometime before that with George Mamsurov. Talk to you soon, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.